Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a wild geopolitical roller coaster. We're going to track the really dynamic and honestly often dramatic pendulum swing of the relationship between India and the ASEAN nations over the last several decades. If you want to understand the modern Indo-Pacific, you absolutely have to understand this relationship. It's a massive story of early brotherhood, deep Cold War freezes, mutual desperation, and now high-stakes modern strategy.
Okay, let's dive into this. To physically ground ourselves, just think about the geography of the ASEAN region relative to India. We're talking about nations like Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, and Myanmar, just to name a few. These nations sit right at the strategic crossroads of the world's oceans, literally right next door to the massive populations and economies of both India and China. How India interacts with this bloc of 10 nations basically shapes the entire security and economic architecture of Asia.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, post-colonial solidarity. Second, the Cold War divide. Third, the post-Cold War pivot. Fourth, modern strategic partnership. And finally, number 5, challenges and the future. Let's start with Section 1, post-colonial solidarity, the early brotherhood. Right out of the gate in the 1940s, India acted as a serious diplomatic heavyweight. The Indian nationalist elite actively campaigned against imperialism everywhere they saw it. They argued against it on moral grounds, calling out economic exploitation and racism, but also on hard strategic grounds. India knew that its own independent foreign policy required a fully decolonized Asia. So, as we move into the 1950s, India is heavily involved in the region, even taking the lead on the International Commission of Supervision and Control in Indochina. And this next detail brilliantly illustrates the sheer drama of the era. When the Dutch tried to reestablish control over Indonesia and actually imposed an air blockade, India didn't just sit back and write angry letters to the UN. The Indian Air Force flew supply sorties. In an incredible display of solidarity, Biju Patnaik personally flew into Sumatra to extract Indonesian Prime Minister Sultan Syahrir and gave him refuge in India. It's a wild moment that shows how geopolitical history is so often shaped by heroic individual human actions.
Now, what's really interesting about this era is the stark contrast in perception. The Western view, championed by figures like Winston Churchill, saw Indian Prime Minister Nehru as the light of Asia. He was basically their go-to interlocutor for the whole continent. But flip over to the ASEAN view, and India's bid to play the leader wasn't exactly welcome. Many delegates in Southeast Asia were terrified that the end of European colonialism would just be replaced by a new era of Chinese or Indian imperialism. They were highly suspicious of what they saw as India's paternalism.
Furthermore, the relationship began to fundamentally crack on economic and strategic grounds. While ASEAN nations were out there experimenting with vigorous, export-oriented economic policies, New Delhi adopted autarkic, very self-sufficient domestic policies. Honestly, their economies simply weren't complementary. And then came 1962. India suffered a disastrous military defeat at the hands of China. Overnight, India's claim that it could provide military security to newly independent Southeast Asian states just evaporated.
Moving on to Section 2, the Cold War divide, a deep freeze.
So the relationship severely deteriorated on a structural level here. As the U.S. became more involved in Vietnam, India offered stiff diplomatic opposition, leaning much closer to a pro-Soviet tilt. Meanwhile, ASEAN had a very distinct pro-Western tilt. They were fundamentally standing on completely opposite sides of the global ideological chessboard. Let's walk through exactly how this mistrust escalated year by year. In 1965, during India's war with Pakistan, Indonesia actually threatened to open a second front against India. Then, in 1967, the Indian Navy decided to take over the job of the retreating British Navy east of Suez, which deeply, deeply alarmed Indonesia and others. But the ultimate wedge was driven in 1971. That's when India signed a massive 20-year peace treaty with the Soviet Union and defeated Pakistan in a major war. After that, ASEAN viewed India's intentions with extreme suspicion. Misperceptions were rampant during this time, and frankly, diplomatic blunders really didn't help. In the late 1960s, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi proposed a regional grouping in Asia. The problem? It sounded almost identical to the collective security system being proposed by the Soviet Union. Southeast Asian leaders naturally assumed India was just doing the Soviets' bidding and trying to undermine ASEAN's own alliances. Add to this India's later recognition of the Kampuchean or Cambodian government after Vietnam's invasion, and ASEAN was totally put off by what they saw as Indian gunboat diplomacy. Yet, amidst this deep freeze, there were some fascinating individual outliers. Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was actually a great admirer of India and desperately wanted them to step up as a regional power. After the Chinese nuclear test in 1964, he actually urged India to conduct its own nuclear test. He even advocated for an Asian Monroe Doctrine to prevent foreign poaching in the region. It just goes to show that even during the absolute lowest points, some leaders in ASEAN clearly recognize the strategic necessity of a strong India. Which brings us to Section 3, the post-Cold War pivot, looking east.
So what triggered this massive pivot? Well, it was essentially mutual desperation. With the fall of the USSR, the Indian-Soviet treaty ended, and India was desperately searching for new partners. So in 1991, India officially unveiled its Look East policy. But here's the thing, ASEAN needed India too. Why? Because China was becoming increasingly assertive, laying claims to the Spratly and Paracel Islands in the South China Sea. Under this looming uncertainty, Southeast Asia looked right back to India as a vital potential balancer against Chinese power. Let's look at how this policy transformed into real, pragmatic trust. We moved far beyond the suspicions of the 1970s. India began actively pursuing defense diplomacy. Nations started conducting joint naval patrols. Singapore even began utilizing India's missile launching facilities at Chandipur. And India leased the Kalakunda Air Base to Singapore. The deep freeze had officially thawed into active, hands-on military cooperation. Section 4. Modern Strategic Partnership. The marriage of convenience.
So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that this relationship is no longer just about post-colonial sentiment, it is a vital pillar of the modern Indo-Pacific. India upgraded its stance to the Act East policy, making ASEAN the absolute core of its regional vision. And they're united by very real shared threats. China is locked in territorial disputes in the South China Sea with ASEAN nations and locked in a bitter border row with India in eastern Ladakh. To secure global supply chains and freedom of navigation, they collaborate deeply through mechanisms like the ADMM+, bringing defense ministers together to maintain a rule-based order.
But we do have to look at the numbers, and this one is pretty stark, 10.6%. While ASEAN is India's fourth largest trading partner, trade with ASEAN makes up only about 10.6% of India's overall trade. For a strategic partnership of this sheer magnitude, that economic engine is significantly underperforming. And this introduces the massive friction points that still exist today. And that brings us to our final section, challenges and the future, roadblocks to synergy. Let's break these roadblocks down. First, economics. India has an unfavorable balance of trade with ASEAN nations. This fear of deepening its trade deficit, particularly with China via the ASEAN bloc, led to a massive geopolitical shockwave when India completely pulled out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, trade deal. Second, logistics. India is committed to massive connectivity projects, like the India-Myanmar-Thailand Trilateral Highway, which is absolutely crucial for linking India's northeastern states to ASEAN. But severe delays and ineffective negotiations constantly halt progress. The vision is definitely there, but the execution really lags. And that leaves us with this final, high-stakes question. Can India and ASEAN actually overcome their internal economic and logistical roadblocks in time to effectively secure the Indo-Pacific? We've watched them go from early brotherhood to bitter suspicion, right up to a modern marriage of strategic convenience. But as the geopolitical pressure in the region reaches a boiling point, they need to turn that 10.6% trade reality into a true seamless alliance. The entire future of the Asian century depends on the answer to that exact question. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. Keep learning, and we'll see you next time.